I never should have taken the challenge. Looking back now, every fiber of my being screams that this was a mistake, that some doors, especially the ones bolted shut by time, are meant to stay closed. But when you spend enough nights chasing after the next thrill, when you've seen enough fake ghost videos and staged haunted house explorations, you start believing you're immune to fear. You laugh in the face of it, mock it, and push the boundaries just to prove to yourself, and to the faceless crowd watching through their screens, that nothing can shake you. That's how I ended up standing in front of Ravencrest Asylum, a decaying corpse of a building silhouetted against the night sky, its broken windows like hollow eye sockets, watching, waiting. The challenge was simple: spend the night alone inside and record everything. No tricks, no staged screams, just me, a flashlight, and my camera. A test of nerve. A game. At least, that's what I told myself. The second I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It wasn't just the dust, the stagnant scent of rotting wood and mildew that hung thick in my throat, it was something else, something deeper, like the building itself was breathing me in. The door groaned shut behind me with a sound so final it sent an involuntary shiver up my spine, but I forced a smirk, whispering to my camera, well, no turning back now. My voice felt too loud, swallowed too quickly by the vast emptiness around me. The hallways stretched ahead, lined with peeling wallpaper and rusted gurneys that stood like silent sentinels in the dark. Faded patient files littered the floor, their edges curling like fingers grasping for something unseen. The stories in those files were probably horrifying, stories of the mentally ill, the forgotten, the ones who checked in but never checked out. I told myself they were just names on paper. Just echoes of the past. But when my flashlight flickered, and I caught the briefest glimpse of a shadow at the end of the corridor that hadn't been there before, my stomach clenched with something I refused to call fear. I pushed forward, shaking off the unease crawling up my spine, focusing instead on the heavy silence pressing down on me like a lead blanket. There was no sound, not even the distant creak of shifting beams, no scurrying rats, no whisper of wind through the shattered windows. Just absolute, suffocating stillness. And then, just as I was convincing myself that the shadow had been a trick of the light, something else caught my attention, a door that looked different from the rest. It wasn't rotted or broken. It didn't hang off its hinges like the others. No, this one was perfectly intact, with a brass nameplate gleaming beneath my flashlight's trembling beam. Do not enter. The words were clear, precise, untouched by time. My pulse quickened, a small, rational part of my mind screaming to turn around, to walk away, to not open that door. But I had come here for the thrill. And thrill seekers don't turn back. The brass nameplate gleamed, untouched by time, its do not enter engraving so sharp and precise that it stood in stark contrast to the decayed world surrounding it. My fingers hesitated, hovering over the handle, my instincts twisting into knots deep in my stomach. It wasn't just that the door was pristine in a place that had rotted for decades, it was the feeling that something was waiting behind it, something that had been there far too long. But hesitation wasn't an option. I had an audience, a challenge, and a reputation to uphold. Swallowing the unease crawling up my spine, I reached out and gripped the cold metal handle, turning it slowly, half expecting resistance. Instead, it gave way without a sound, gliding open effortlessly, revealing a room that shouldn't exist. The air inside was warm, unnervingly fresh, thick with a subtle scent of lavender and something medicinal. Unlike the rest of the asylum, where decay, mold, and time had left their mark, this room was perfectly preserved. The walls were clean, a muted shade of blue, lined with neatly arranged bookshelves and photographs, all covered with an impossible lack of dust. In the center stood a bed, sheets tucked so neatly they could have been military issued. A cup of tea sat on the nightstand, steam still rising from the liquid. I froze, my breath hitching as my flashlight trembled in my grip. This wasn't possible. No one had lived here in over 70 years. And yet, it felt as if the occupant had just stepped out, as if they had only momentarily left, and any second now, they'd walk right back in. My camera was rolling, capturing everything, and I muttered under my breath, trying to keep my voice steady. What the hell? But my words felt small in the thick silence. Then I saw it. On the bed, a journal, open to a page scrawled with old, inked handwriting, neat, deliberate, waiting for me to read it. I stepped forward, drawn in despite every nerve in my body telling me to turn around and leave this place behind. The journal belonged to Eleanor Wills, a patient admitted in 1947. The name was vaguely familiar, a flicker of recognition from the files I had skimmed through earlier, but my mind wasn't prepared for what I saw written on the page. The words shifted, fresh ink bleeding across the paper, twisting and forming as if being written in real time. You shouldn't be here. My heart slammed against my ribs, and a sharp gasp tore from my lips as I staggered backward, my flashlight flickering violently as the air in the room grew colder in an instant. My hands trembled, gripping the journal tighter as my breath came out in short, panicked bursts. Then, from somewhere in the hallway behind me, I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak, like a door opening, followed by footsteps. I wasn't alone. Someone, something, had just entered the asylum. I stood frozen, my breath trapped somewhere between my chest and throat, my ears straining against the unnatural silence that had swallowed the air around me. The footsteps I had heard weren't distant, weren't echoes of the past, they were here, inside the asylum, slow and deliberate, pressing against the old, rotting floorboards just beyond the doorframe. I turned toward the entrance of the room, flashlight gripped so tightly in my trembling fingers that my knuckles ached, the camera still rolling, capturing everything. My pulse pounded against my skull, each thud a deafening drumbeat in the otherwise suffocating stillness. But as I stared at the threshold, at the empty hall beyond it, the sickening realization seeped in like venom, the footsteps had stopped, but nothing had entered. The air in the asylum hung thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands, and yet I knew, I wasn't alone. The journal in my grip burned cold against my palm, the inked words on the open page still fresh, still impossibly shifting as if someone was writing them from the other side. My fingers shook as I forced my gaze downward, breath hitching at the sight of new words forming beneath the last message. The script was old-fashioned, precise, a whisper of the past bleeding into the present. If you step outside, you will not find the asylum as you left it. My stomach twisted, a knot of pure dread curling inside me as my grip on the flashlight tightened, my every instinct screaming at me to ignore the warning. But I had to see. I had to prove to myself that I was imagining things, that fear was warping my mind. Slowly, carefully, I turned my gaze back to the doorway. The moment my eyes landed on the hallway beyond, something shifted, something wrong. The walls, once cracked and covered in decades of dust and rot, were different. The peeling paint had smoothed, the tarnished metal doors lining the corridor now gleamed, pristine and untouched by time. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp and sterile, as if the asylum was still functioning, still alive. The overhead lights, ones that had been shattered and dark when I entered, were now flickering to life, one by one, casting a sickly fluorescent glow down the impossibly long hallway. But the worst part wasn't the changes in the building. The worst part was the figures now standing at the end of the corridor. Distant, motionless, draped in pale hospital gowns, their heads slightly tilted, watching. Their faces were blurred, like smudges of static, their bodies eerily still, too still, as if waiting for me to make the first move. My breath hitched, my chest tightening with a fear that rooted deep, primal and undeniable. The asylum was no longer abandoned. And I had made a terrible mistake. I couldn't move. My breath felt lodged in my throat, my legs locked in place as if the asylum itself had wrapped invisible chains around my ankles, rooting me where I stood. The figures at the end of the corridor remained still, their hospital gowns swaying despite the absence of wind. The lights above flickered erratically, pulsing like a dying heartbeat, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched toward me as if they had a mind of their own. My camera trembled in my grip, its screen showing the same figures, but there was something different. Something worse. Through the lens, their faces were no longer blurred. I could see them. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips stitched closed with thick, black thread. My stomach lurched. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to shut the door, to barricade myself inside that impossibly untouched room and pretend I had never stepped out. But before I could react, before I could even blink, the figures moved. It wasn't a natural movement. They didn't walk. They didn't run. They just shifted. 1 second, they were at the end of the hallway. The next, they were closer, 5 feet closer, without a single sound. My pulse jackhammered in my ears, my skin ice-cold despite the sweat forming along my spine. I took a step back, my boot scraping against the floor, the sound deafening in the silence. As if responding to my movement, the figures tilted their heads in unison, their mouths twitching beneath the crude stitches as if trying to speak. Then, another shift, closer this time. They were halfway down the hallway now, their bodies stiff, their heads still twisted at an unnatural angle. The air felt thick, too heavy to breathe. I forced my shaking hands to grip the camera tighter, whispering under my breath, "No. No, 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 this isn't real." And then it happened. The lights went out completely. The hallway plunged into absolute darkness, swallowing everything, including the figures. My breath hitched, my ears straining for any sound, but the silence was unbearable, suffocating. I knew they were still there. I could feel them. I fumbled desperately for my flashlight, my fingers slick with sweat as I clicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the suffocating blackness. And then, just inches from my face, the light revealed a stitched mouth, rotting lips stretched into something that might have once been a smile. A breath, cold, so cold, brushed against my skin. And then a whisper, soft and sickly sweet, "Why did you leave?" I didn't scream. I couldn't. The breath had been stolen from my lungs, crushed under the weight of the thing standing inches from my face. My flashlight trembled in my grip, its beam flickering wildly over the grotesque, stitched mouth, the thick, black thread sewn into pale, rotting flesh, pulling the lips into a horrific semblance of a grin. Its breath was ice-cold, smelling of damp earth and something sweetly rancid, like decayed flowers left to rot in the sun. Every muscle in my body locked up, my nerves frozen in place as its head tilted slowly, the stitches straining, cracking, leaking something dark. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but the thing, it didn't lunge, it didn't reach for me. It simply stood there, inches away, watching, waiting. And then, in a whisper that felt like it had been breathed directly into my skull, it repeated the question. "Why did you leave?" That was when I snapped. My paralysis shattered, replaced by raw, primal terror. I bolted, shoving my body backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I spun and ran, not caring where, not thinking, just moving. My boots pounded against the asylum floor, the sound of my own heartbeat nearly deafening in my ears. The hallway stretched, twisted, the walls pulsing like a living, breathing thing as I tore past rusted gurneys, empty wheelchairs that seemed to turn on their own, patient doors slamming open as I ran. And then, just as I reached what should have been the main corridor, I stopped dead in my tracks. The asylum had changed. The walls, once lined with decay and peeling paint, were now immaculate, restored, as if time had reversed itself. The air reeked of disinfectant and something faintly metallic, the glow of buzzing fluorescent lights illuminating what was no longer an abandoned ruin, but an active institution. My stomach twisted violently as my eyes landed on figures in white, moving down the hallway, nurses, orderlies, doctors, patients. But something was wrong. Their movements were wrong. Jittery, delayed, as if time itself was skipping in fragmented pieces. Their faces were obscured, blurred like distorted television static, their mouths moving in silent conversations I couldn't hear. Then, as if sensing my presence, every single one of them stopped. Heads snapping toward me in unison, eyes hollow, empty voids. The building hummed around me, a low, droning frequency vibrating in my bones. And then, from behind me, that same whisper, crawling through my mind like an infection. You left the room. That was a mistake. I didn't move. I couldn't. My pulse hammered in my skull, a frantic, uneven rhythm that clashed with the unnatural stillness pressing in from all sides. The figures in the hallway, the nurses, the orderlies, the patients, stood frozen, staring, their faceless heads tilting in eerie synchronization, as if assessing me, as if waiting for something. My fingers dug into the cold metal of my camera, knuckles aching from the force of my grip. The asylum was alive, shifting around me, the sterile white walls breathing, pulsing like the inside of a living body. And then, without warning, the figures moved. It was instant. 1 second, they were at the far end of the hall. The next, they were closer, *** 10 feet closer, their static blurred faces distorting, glitching, as if reality itself was struggling to contain them. My stomach lurched with raw, unfiltered panic, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt weighed down, the air around me thickening, pressing into my chest like a suffocating hand. The lights above flickered violently, the buzzing hum growing into a distorted wail, a sound that clawed at the inside of my skull. My breathing turned ragged as I took an unsteady step backward, the walls around me stretching, elongating, the doors lining the hallway flickering between open and closed, new and decayed, real and impossible. I knew what was happening. I knew the moment I had stepped out of that room, I had left behind the version of the asylum I had entered. And now, I was trapped inside something else. Something hungry. Then came the sound. A dragging, wet sound, echoing from behind me. My body seized, dread pooling like ice water in my gut. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look. But my body betrayed me, my head twisting ever so slightly, just enough for the beam of my flashlight to catch it, a figure crawling from the doorway I had left behind. But it wasn't human. Its limbs were wrong, elongated, bending in places they shouldn't bend. Its fingers clawed at the floor, its skin stretched too tight over its bones, its stitched mouth straining open, tearing as it spoke. The voice was wet, gurgling, choked with something thick and rotten. You weren't supposed to leave. The words slithered through the air, wrapping around my mind like barbed wire, and that was it, I ran. I turned and sprinted down the never-ending hallway, past doors that weren't supposed to be there, past figures that shifted whenever I blinked, past the impossible, past everything that should not exist. But no matter how fast I ran, the hallway kept stretching. And somewhere behind me, the dragging sound followed. Something was chasing me. And it was getting closer. I ran. I ran even though my lungs felt like they were shredding apart, even though my legs screamed in protest, even though every inch of my body was drowning in a cold sweat that soaked through my clothes. The hallway stretched, impossibly long, the walls closing in, the doors flickering between decay and pristine sterility. Behind me, the sound of dragging flesh scraped against the floor, a wet, sickening squelch that made my stomach lurch. It was following. It was faster now. My camera bounced violently against my chest, still recording, capturing everything, the twisted, pulsing walls, the figures that stood motionless in every doorway, the shadows that moved when I wasn't looking. And then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a door. Different from the others. Wooden, old, marked with something etched deep into its surface. A name. Eleanor Wills. I didn't have time to hesitate. My fingers grasped the rusted handle, yanking it open, throwing myself inside before whatever was behind me could reach me. The door slammed shut behind me, the echo ringing through my skull, sealing me inside the room. My breath came out in ragged gasps, my vision swimming, the world tilting under the weight of adrenaline still surging through my veins. And then, slowly, I turned. The room was the same. The same untouched space I had first found, pristine, warm, completely out of place in this nightmare of an asylum. The same neatly made bed. The same bookshelves. The same cup of tea, steam still curling from the surface. It was like I had never left. Like I had never stepped out into the warped, decayed version of Ravencrest. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs as my gaze landed on the journal still sitting on the bed, open to a fresh page. The ink was wet. Someone had just written in it. Someone was here. My fingers trembled as I reached for the book, my breath shallow, my hands slick with sweat as I tilted it toward the dim light and read the first line. You left the room. That was a mistake. The air around me shifted, thickened, like the walls themselves were pressing closer. My skin erupted in cold, stinging goosebumps as I read the next line, my pulse hammering so hard I thought my ribs would crack. You let her out. A sharp creak cut through the silence, sending a jolt of pure terror through me. I turned my head slowly, every nerve in my body screaming not to look. But I did. My flashlight flickered. The closet door, the one that had been closed before, was open. Just a crack. And from the darkness within, something moved. A shape. A shadow. A figure that had been waiting. And then, a voice. Soft. Hollow. Whispering. I'm home. The whisper slithered through the air like a breath of cold wind, soft but sharp enough to slice through the thick silence. I'm home. My stomach clenched so hard it felt like my insides had turned to ice. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering in my ears, drowning out all rational thought. The closet door stood slightly ajar, darkness spilling from the crack like ink seeping through torn fabric. The air in the room had changed, thicker, colder, suffocatingly heavy. My flashlight trembled in my grip, its flickering beam barely cutting through the black void beyond the door. I knew, without a doubt, something was inside. Something that had been waiting. Something that had been locked away for a reason. Then, the door creaked open wider. Not fast, not sudden, slow, deliberate, like something inside wanted me to watch. The darkness within was thick, unnatural, an abyss that shouldn't exist in a place like this. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, to tear my gaze away before I saw something I wasn't meant to see. But it was too late. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, just a fraction of a breath, I saw her. Eleanor. Or what was left of her. Her body was wrong. Thin, twisted, her limbs unnaturally stretched, her fingers elongated into jagged, claw-like points. Her hair hung in tangled, black clumps, matted against a face so gaunt and hollow it barely looked human. The stitches, they were still there, crude and black, forcing her lips into that grotesque, stitched-shut grin. But the worst part wasn't her body. It was her eyes. Wide, unblinking, deep pits of blackened void that held no reflection, no light, no soul. And she was moving toward me. Not walking, gliding. Her feet never touched the floor, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the wooden boards, shifting in ways that weren't possible. Then, the asylum woke up. All at once, doors slammed open down the hallway, metal gurneys crashing against the walls, echoing like gunshots in the emptiness. The air filled with a sound I will never forget, a chorus of voices, moaning, sobbing, whispering, all overlapping in a twisted symphony of pain. Footsteps pounded against the floor, but they weren't mine. The hallway outside wasn't empty anymore. The patients had returned. Figures in hospital gowns, some dragging themselves across the floor, some missing pieces of themselves, some standing eerily still, watching, waiting. The asylum had been abandoned for decades. But now, it was full again. And they weren't going to let me leave. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, the weight of the asylum pressing against me like a living force. My flashlight flickered violently, its weak beam barely illuminating the chaos unraveling around me. Eleanor moved closer, her body twisting unnaturally, her stitched grin stretching as if the blackened thread could barely contain the expression beneath. The walls trembled, the distant echoes of wailing patients growing louder, closer, surrounding me from every direction. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned, blindly lunging for the door, yanking it open with a force that sent me stumbling into the hallway beyond. I didn't care where I was running, I just knew I had to get out. The asylum was no longer the decayed ruin I had entered. The walls were pristine, the floors waxed and sterile, the air thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic and something metallic that made bile rise in my throat. But it was wrong, impossibly wrong. The doors that had once lined the hallway were now sealed shut, thick steel slabs bolted into place, each with a small, smeared window that revealed the horrors locked inside. Figures moved behind the glass, skeletal hands clawing at the reinforced barriers, bodies twisting and writhing in ways no human should be able to move. Some screamed without sound, their mouths stretched open in silent agony, their eyes locked onto me as if they had been waiting. Then, from behind me, the sound of bare feet slapping against the floor. Fast. Close. Coming for me. I whipped my head around, my pulse hammering so hard I thought my chest would cave in. Eleanor was running now, her limbs contorting, her body lurching with unnatural speed, her blackened eyes locked onto mine with a hunger that sent pure terror ripping through me. I sprinted, tearing through the endless corridor, my boots echoing against the cold, sterile floor, the lights above buzzing and flickering in violent bursts. Up ahead, the exit. The heavy metal doors that led outside. I was almost there. My body burned, every muscle screaming, every breath searing my lungs. The asylum groaned around me, the walls warping, the floor buckling beneath my feet. I reached the doors, my hands slamming against the rusted push bar, and they swung open effortlessly. I stumbled forward into the night, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed onto damp, overgrown grass. The asylum was behind me now, its towering frame looming in the darkness, silent and still, just as it had been when I arrived. My chest heaved, my hands digging into the cold earth as I tried to process what had just happened. Had I really escaped? Had I actually made it out? My camera was still strapped to my chest, the small red recording light blinking steadily, as if none of it had ever happened. And then I noticed something. My breath caught in my throat. On my wrist, a hospital bracelet. The name written on it in faded black ink. My own. And then I understood. I had never left. I stared at the hospital bracelet strapped tightly around my wrist, my fingers trembling as I traced the faded ink of my own name. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the realization settled over me like a suffocating weight. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. I had made it out. I had escaped. Hadn't I? My gaze snapped back to the asylum, its towering silhouette unmoving in the darkness, silent and lifeless once more. But something felt off. The air around me was too still, too cold, too wrong. My camera was still strapped to my chest, the red recording light blinking steadily. The footage. It would prove that this had all really happened, that I had made it out. That I wasn't losing my mind. With shaking hands, I fumbled for the device, flipping the small screen open, my thumb scrolling to the playback option. The screen crackled to life. Static at first, then darkness. My own voice whispered from the speakers, low and shaky, narrating the events leading up to the moment I had opened the cursed door to Eleanor's room. I scrubbed forward in the footage, searching for the moment when I had run, when I had made it to the exit, but the screen showed something different. My blood turned to ice. I was still inside. The footage showed me standing in Eleanor's room, the journal clutched in my hands, my flashlight casting weak shadows against the peeling walls. I had never left. My breath hitched as I scrubbed further ahead, desperate, panicked, but every single second of the recording showed me still inside Ravencrest Asylum. My hands shook violently, my stomach twisting into a sickening knot. I had run. I had felt the night air, the wet grass beneath my knees, the burn of escape in my lungs. Hadn't I? But the proof was right there on the screen. Then, the whisper came again. Soft. Wrong. Close. My body seized, my skin crawling with ice as a shadow stretched over me, long and unnatural under the dim moonlight. My camera flickered, the screen glitching as a distorted image appeared, a reflection of me, standing in the very same room I had tried to escape from. A hand rested on my shoulder. A thin, bony hand. The stitched mouth beside my ear curled into a grotesque smile. My breath came out in a broken gasp, my limbs locking in place as the voice slithered through the air one final time, seeping into my bones like venom. Welcome home.